What comes to mind when I say the word metaphor? For writers, and particularly poets, this might be a word that you think about fairly frequently, perhaps much to your enjoyment or displeasure. For others, its association might lie entirely with specific memories of a past teacher asking you to recite the definition of a metaphor, but never actually giving you creative opportunities to use it in your own writing. Instead, likely talking about Shakespeare's "Life is but a walking shadow" line from Macbeth. Now, what did Shakespeare mean by this, class? And before you raise your hand, just remember, as with all literature, there's of course only one right answer. The mention of this literary device can cause a myriad of different reactions from people, from dread to excitement to total indifference.
I don't give a
I'm a published poet, and I have what you could call a complicated and at times slightly toxic relationship with metaphor, one that's taken me several years to recognize. But before I get into my issues with metaphor, it's important that we're on the same page about what a metaphor is and what function it serves. Why do authors use this literary technique in the first place? In a lot of ways, the metaphor is one of the earliest examples we have of a literary paradox. You see, its function is to bring a reader closer to an understanding of something by, ironically, taking them further away from that thing. In a metaphor, your attention is redirected from whatever the author is trying to describe to something distinct and familiar. And it is through this comparison, this other lens, that you're able to see the initial object clearer. The literal object in a metaphor is called the tenor, and the thing the author is comparing it to is called the vehicle. In Emily Dickinson's poem "Fame is a Fickle Food," for example, she redirects our attention from the idea of fame to the image of food on a plate. In Dickinson's case, this is an example of an extended metaphor. Instead of being a single line, it is used throughout the two stanzas and elaborated on. Fame is a fickle food on a shifting plate, and even passing crows turn down its crumbs and search for something better. In fact, only humans are foolish enough to eat and eventually die from this food. Naturally, animals are above it. The vehicle of the fickle food interacts with other things in the poem, which is why I call it an extended metaphor. It moves, and it's used as a sort of prop in this scene. It is worth noting, however, that despite being extended, the metaphor remains relatively brief and simple, as the poem is only comprised of two short stanzas. As Miss Emily Dickinson and many other poets, I myself love metaphors, and they're often what feel most effective in conveying what I want to the reader. So then, what's the issue? Well, I've noticed that in the past, my relationship to metaphor has been one of dependency. It's not that I hid in metaphors so much as I felt so incredibly seen by them that my writing never wanted to leave them. I would find a metaphor that I adored and extend it to the next verse and the next verse, elaborating on the details of this metaphor so that I could stay inside of it for the entire poem. I'd build them into these sort of shelters on the page, exiting only briefly, opening the door, maybe going on the occasional walk around the block, but eventually retreating back into that metaphor in fear of losing myself. See what I mean? I decided it best to leave that semi-convoluted comparison in this video because I think it demonstrates my point more than anything. Extended metaphors, whether I like it or not, are likely always going to be a part of my intuition as a writer. But what results from that is what's potentially my writing's greatest and most utilized strength is also what can limit it. But I read a collection recently that helped me see the function of a metaphor a bit differently. It's titled "I Don't Want to Be Understood" by Joshua Jennifer Espinoza, an author who also seems to have an adoration for metaphor. And you could even argue that metaphor is the dominating literary technique of this collection, but my fascination comes with how she uses it. As I mentioned, metaphor is something that my writing sometimes finds itself stuck in rather than moving through. But what if I told you that Espinoza uses it for the exact opposite purpose? Not only do her metaphors refuse to be barriers, but they are the primary stepping stones through which her verse moves and leaps. Don't worry, I'll give an example. You see, Espinoza uses this technique called parataxis, which is where an author will place phrases or sentences next to each other without a traditional flow from one fragment to the next. And specifically, she does this with metaphor, placing her metaphors on singular paratactical lines. I'll show an example in just a second. But despite metaphor serving as her most intriguing tool, I just want to get this out of the way. Her use of metaphor is still far from overused. Literal descriptions of the speaker's experiences as a trans woman simultaneously drive the book forward. Espinoza's grace in incorporating these literal storytelling scenes, interactions, and internal thoughts in a collection that seems to be simultaneously a love letter to the metaphor caught me off guard in the best way. The poem To My Parents is one of the strongest examples of Espinoza's metaphor use. She writes, quote, "I was a crumb beneath the couch. I was a ghost. I was a girl with plans. I was my head against the tile in the front of the fireplace. I was the mantle above the fireplace, the one that held our portrait. I was the frame around the photograph, but not the photograph. I was a boy's skeleton buried beneath the backyard sprinkler. I was a maggot in the dog's legs after months of neglect." She goes on for another page using the same sort of format for all of her lines. Here, the use of metaphor feels so natural and effective in its description that on first read through, it camouflages with the lines that aren't metaphors at all. Just like Espinoza's metaphors, her literal statements, like, "I was a girl with plans," are matter-of-fact, direct, and to the point as they guide you to the next line. And so all of these lines, whether figurative or literal, serve a similar function. Unlike many other collections, I'm thinking particularly of Justin Philip Reed's Indecency, which I reviewed in another video, a beautiful collection, but very different from this one. It's fascinating how Espinoza relies very little on adjectives to describe things. We see this poem carries very little direct description and honestly, very few adjectives at all, and instead allows the metaphors to speak for themselves, bringing us closer to an understanding of something by diverting our attention away from that thing. In a way, this alleviates her poems of a desperation to be understood through traditional means of description, at least an overt desperation. Though I read the collection's title as a partial rebellion to being outcast from society as a trans woman, an aware coping mechanism of sorts, and thus not a completely genuine statement, there is an ease, a lack of desperation to Espinoza's poetry still. This ease is afforded mainly through the speaker's willingness to place these short metaphors in white space without the need to elaborate or explain. Perhaps the speaker implies less so that she does not want to be understood, and more so the titular message of the collection's final poem. It doesn't matter if I'm understood. This collection has really made me realize how little desperation there is in parataxis. Page 47 employs a similar technique, though I would say it is less all-encompassing than in To My Parents. It is one of the four pieces Espinoza titles poem, a title that I infer is a call to the very form of poetry as a medium through which the author is, or is not, understood via these metaphors. She writes, quote, "Bliss is where I was never touched. Bliss is a dream haven projected through my eyelids." So here we see Espinoza trying to do what many poets have done for centuries, which is trying to grapple with and understand that which is not physically quantifiable, this concept of bliss. Espinoza uses no adjectives or actions to describe bliss directly, instead describing it through describing something else, demonstrating once again the true anomaly and beauty of the metaphor. Yet, despite her admiration for this literary technique, she doesn't find one metaphor and stay inside of it. She's not cowardly like that. And so, while I've often used metaphor as a shelter because of how much comfort it provides me, as a writer, more and more I'm learning to find comfort in movement as well. To end off, here is my attempt at a little poem inspired by Espinoza's technique. I'd love to hear about your relationship to metaphor in the comments, and consider dropping a like or subscribing if you enjoyed this video. It really helps people see my content, and there is a severe deficit of poetry content on YouTube. Access to monthly prompts such as this one, along with a bunch of other benefits related to writing, are found on my Patreon, so consider checking that out if you're interested. Without further ado, I hope you enjoyed my poem, and I will see you guys next time. Diagnosis cycle. My father's love was the shape of the forest I walked through. The forest I walked through was a body of mangled roots. A body of mangled roots was the IV tube sluicing to impermanence.
Impermanence was a soccer ball I crashed into the window. The window was shards of daylight on the floor. Daylight was a spoon with a metal nick scratching up against my mouth. My mouth was a gun loaded with rubber threats to God. Rubber was the taste of bad hospital food. Soul food was a parasite I could never forgive. Forgiveness was the sound of coins sliding into my faulty machine. A faulty machine was what I watched one man become. A man was a black crate filling with water, sinking into the sea. The sea was the love he decided would fill his aching lungs.